Hello, my name's Andrew Bloodworth. I'm an economic geologist and I'm a policy director at the British Geological Survey in the UK. I've called this talk Charging Ahead because it's about how the transport industry, and particularly the car industry, is transforming itself from internal combustion engines to electric power, hydrogen power, and the impact that that's having on raw materials and the geosciences. This isn't the first time that the transport industry has transformed itself. If we go back 100 years, we can see this picture of Regent Street in 1904, which is dominated by horse-drawn transport. And just 16 years later, in 1920, there's hardly a horse to be seen. Everything has moved on to internal combustion engine power. And that speed of transformation is going on in the automotive sector across the world at the moment. What's driving that? Well, in the UK, it's not just about climate change, it's also about energy security and concerns about our dependence on imported petroleum. It's very much driven also by concerns about air quality, particularly in our cities, and the pollution that we get from internal combustion engines. But especially now at this time of COP26, we're all thinking about the energy transition and the need to transform our economy and our transport systems in response to what's happening with climate change. The scale of this is enormous. It's not just about the UK. Last week, we had the announcement from the UK government about their net zero strategy. But this is a transformation that's going on worldwide. And you can see from the graph on the right there how the global electric vehicle stock is increasing extremely rapidly. And this is having profound implications for the raw materials that this sector uses. So how different is an EV to a normal internal combustion engine car? Well, it differs in its powertrain. This is an electric motor from an electric vehicle, drives the wheels. Some of these vehicles rely on electricity generated by a hydrogen fuel cell, and that contains another set of materials. And thirdly, of course, they all have some kind of energy storage in them. Pure electric vehicles have a very large battery. Hydrogen-powered vehicles still have a battery somewhat smaller than that. And these batteries contain quite large amounts of different metals in their anodes and their cathodes. And these also have profound implications for the raw materials required. So here's our electric vehicle. We use here an American example of Chevy Bolt, which is an electric vehicle manufactured in the US. They're quite heavy electric vehicles, 22% heavier than the equivalent size vehicle, in this case, an internal combustion engine powered Golf. And most of that extra weight is the battery. Most EVs contain about 70% more aluminium and maybe about 80% more copper than the equivalent internal combustion engine car. They contain quite a lot of what we call active battery materials, the anode and cathode materials, things like nickel, cobalt, lithium, manganese, and graphite. They contain a substantial amount of rare earth elements in the motor, in the electric motor, about 1 kilogram of rare earths, things like neodymium and dysprosium. They have quite large amounts of semiconductor material in them compared to internal combustion engine cars. And hydrogen powered cars with fuel cells contain 10 to 20 grams of platinum compared to 3 to 7 grams in a catalytic converter in a conventional car. All this means is that these vehicles, these electric vehicles, contain a much larger variety of metals, and sometimes in much greater quantities than internal combustion engine cars. And of course, that all presents challenges for us in terms of providing the raw materials which go into these vehicles. And don't take my word for it, the International Energy Agency EV Outlook says that this is going to be big demand for new materials in the automotive sector, require an increased attention to raw material supply. Some people have said that we're moving from the age of petroleum to the age of metal, because it's metal that drives these electric vehicles. And we can see that already manifesting itself in demand for certain metals. And the example I've used here is cobalt production, global cobalt production. And you can see for the last 50 years, cobalt production has bumped along relatively steadily. And then all of a sudden, as electric vehicles in particular and lithium ion batteries in general came into more general usage, the demand for cobalt for cathode material has gone up enormously, and that demand is set to keep rising. Most of that demand is going to come from the earth, from crustal sources. It'll have to be mined. Can we recycle our way out of this? Well, the answer is in the short term, no, we can't. Recycling is really important. It's really important we recover the metals from these vehicles when they come to the end of their lives. But the fact is, we can't recover the metal until these vehicles do come to the end of their lives. And these batteries, the average life of an EV battery is reckoned to be about 7 years, but the batteries might then go on to a second life, say as being used as static energy storage in a home, a sort of second life, a recycled, a reuse of that battery, which might mean that the battery isn't available, the materials in that battery aren't available for recycling for some 20 years. And as demand is growing so quickly, the only way we can fill that recycling gap is to get material from the earth. So what are the implications for geoscience? Well, it means we have to think carefully about metal supply, the physical availability of that metal, where it is, what's the supply chain for supplying that metal into the market, what's the greenhouse gas footprint of producing that metal, and what are the ethical considerations about producing that metal from certain places in the world. In order to assure that metal supply from the Earth's crust, we have to understand the science behind the origins, transport, and concentration processes for these critical metals in various crustal settings. We also, of course, because we need to look to our own environment, the human environment, for some metal supply from recycled sources, we have to understand the ecology, if you like, of that metal in our own environment. We also have to think about other things to do with EVs, like what are the sources of low carbon electricity that we need, and the importance of things like carbon capture and storage, renewable energy and energy storage. And we also have to think about, for hydrogen powered vehicles, the hydrogen economy. How do we supply that hydrogen and where do we store it? And these are just some images of some aspects of that, some geoscience aspects of that, particularly these primary sources. This is my colleague, Catherine Goodenough, looking at lithium pegmatite, a particular rock type, which is rich in lithium, deposit in Ghana in West Africa. And we're looking at other sources. Rare earth metal is really important for the electric motors that go into electric vehicles and hydrogen powered vehicles. These come from a variety of sources, including these rather exotic metal bearing rock types called carbonatites. We're also looking at lithium sources from other geological settings, like the high Andes of South America, where lithium occurs in brines in things called salars, which occur in intermontane basins in these very high mountains. Much of the world's lithium currently comes from these sources. And we're also looking at perhaps co-production of metals from geothermal brines. This is the big geothermal project down at United Downs in southwest England in Cornwall. And the brines that come up from these very deep sources in the Earth's crust, which are full of hot water, which we can convert into electricity or into sustainable heat, also contain dissolved metals. And there are possibilities for recovering these metals, particularly metals like lithium, from these brines. And we also need to understand the onward supply chain from these metals. We need to understand once they've been mined, where are they smelted, where are they refined, where are they processed, and how they move into our economy. So we need to also look at the supply chains for these materials. And as I said earlier, it's not just about the vehicles themselves. We also need to think about what powers these vehicles. And in some cases, they may be powered by hydrogen. So we need to think about where hydrogen's produced, what the byproducts of that hydrogen production are, and where that hydrogen might be stored in the future. And the subsurface has an enormous part to play in that storage. We can use the subsurface to store particularly deposits like evaporite, salt deposits, where we can dissolve out caverns, and we can use those to securely and safely store gases like hydrogen under the ground until we need them for our transport and heating systems. And as part of that hydrogen production, we might also be producing byproduct carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide we can put back into the ground through using carbon capture and storage. So more implications for geoscience, for the transformation of our transport systems. A really profound one for our profession is the fact that the global energy mix is changing, and that there is beginning to be a move away from oil and gas and hydrocarbons and coal. And of course, with that, and again, very pertinent with the COP conference on at the moment, that there are now voices saying that even though we've discovered oil and gas resources, perhaps some of them we should leave in the ground. So there, again, profound implications for what we do about these resources and how we do or don't develop them. And also the electric vehicle revolution is meaning shifting patterns in metal supply, and the growth in importance of some of these battery raw materials like lithium and cobalt and nickel, and some of the metals that we need to manufacture electric motors, things like rare earth elements. And we need to consider in all that the long-term sectoral impact, the impact on geoscience of this energy transition. And of course, even more broadly, we need to consider the new geopolitics for resources that countries and areas that were very important in the global energy supply may change over time, and what is important now or was important 20 years ago may not be that important in the future, and vice versa. So perhaps we are moving to a new age of metal, where we have to consider how that metal moves around the human environment and has moved through the Earth's crust, and how it is extracted from the Earth's crust, and how it may eventually end up back there. And it's becoming the new frontier in geoscience resources, where we really are now really having to consider how we provide the raw materials for the energy transition, for transport systems like electric vehicles, but also for renewable energy technologies like wind turbines. And I'd like to finish there and say thank you for the GeolSoc for inviting me to give this presentation, and also to thank my colleagues at the British Geological Survey. And I'll leave you with that little image of how transport used to be. And thank you very much.